Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, the Praise of Five podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Facebook, and support me on Subscribe Stars, Locals, and Buy Me a Coffee. All right, so this is episode 122 of the Casual Stream, Basics on Political Thought. This is partly inspired by last week's video, where I'll get into it in the prepared presentation, but needless to say, some questions were asked about the case I was making in my reactionaries take L's. And I thought, well, that would be a useful starting point to do a refresher in the basics of political thought, as well as answering that question. So without further ado, we shall begin today's show. The basics of political thought. In our modern age, the terms, concepts, and ideas behind our conception of political thought is muddled at best. Concepts are amorphous and shift as often as the person using them moves the goalposts. We have horseshoe theory, where right and left authoritarian regimes are so much alike that they provide a pull to the liberal democracies who oppose them. We have reactionary thought that says even totalitarian regimes are democratic if they make appeals to popular sovereignty. Much of this confusion is based on the rejection of already well-established principles of political thought that reach back to Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Machiavelli, and the U.S. founding fathers. This shift is manifested in shifting understandings of God, man, and the natural world, a result of the scientific revolution and enlightenment. On a practical note, last week's episode, Reactionaries Taking L's, someone from the chat struggled to understand my claim that autocracy was an Asiatic import, as Greece and Rome had kings before they were democracies or mixed regimes. To that end, I prepared an introduction to political thought. Plato in the Republic is our first work on political thought in the West. It views the polis as a physical and tangible expression of the soul. The physical ordering of the state can be seen as a reification of those elements in the soul that could only otherwise be seen with the intellect. Plato focuses on an end-use definition of the state. His regimes are defined by what their social ordering principle is, or rather than say the number of rulers in a regime. The ideal state, or Callipolis, is defined by the philosopher kings who rule for the sake of virtue. The Technocracy is the rule of warriors for the sake of honor. The Democracy is the rule of merchants for the sake of money. And democracy is the rule of the people for the sake of liberty. And tyrants rule for their own sake of power. After the Callipolis, each is the decayed form of the last. Aristotle categorizes political systems based on the number of rulers in the regime and the ends to which the regime is focused. Aristotle's political work is intertwined with his ethical work. For example, his Nicomachean Ethics ends with a question on the political and how politics can shape ethics. This is answered in Aristotle's The Politics. There are three modes of rule: the one, the few, and the many, each of which has a virtuous and a vicious form. Virtue, in this context, means governing toward the common good of all. Vice is governing for a narrow self-interest. This means that in Aristotle's scheme, there are minimally 6 forms of government, but in theory, there can be more. Using this table, I will showcase the 6 modes of government in Aristotle's thought. So we have row and column. So 3 columns: number, virtue, and vice. And then we have 3 rows: one, few, and the many. So the virtuous form of the one is monarchy. The vicious form is tyranny. The virtuous form of the few is aristocracy, and the vicious form is an oligarchy. The virtuous few of the many is what's called polity or politia, and the vicious form is called democracy. By breaking this down, we see that each form of rule can represent either rule for the common good, or what is often called public spiritedness, or for the good of an individual or clique at the expense of the whole. In a word, a parasite. Let's use some historical examples to illustrate the difference between each of the 6 forms of regime. Macedonian monarchy under Philip II, a contemporary of Aristotle himself, and the English monarchy of Henry V are both virtuous forms of the rule of the one. Because our modern political discourse is so diluted and words are thrown around as insults, words like tyranny are seen as subjective terms, rather than objective terms with a meaning. By objective, I mean that there is for any political regime a set of objective conditions that may or may not hold that, if met, would make a regime tyrannical. Two are the empowering of women and slaves on the one hand, and the use of foreign soldiers on the other. Aristotle sees this as part of the control grid that tyrants use in order to isolate his subjects and have tools to oppress them without having ties of natural affection to their own people. Both Philip II and Henry V trusted their own people. They were, in a sense, seen as avatars of their own people, and their armies and security forces were recruited from their own people rather than foreigners. How is this contrasted with tyranny? A good example of tyranny is the house of the Pisistratids of Athens and Xerxes of Persia. In the former case, when Xerxes invaded Attica in 480 BC, the Pisistratids actively collaborated with this foreign threat in order to be restored to their thrones. Here we see men who wielded power collaborating with the enemies of their own people to return to power. In Herodotus' histories, he has an account of Pythias. Pythias had 5 sons, and Xerxes called all of them to serve in his army for the invasion of Greece. Pythias asked for his eldest son to remain home with him. In return, Xerxes killed the eldest son, cut the son's body in two, and marched his entire army through the space between as a sign of autocratic power. This is tyranny. Within ancient and medieval regimes, aristocracy is often a component of a government rather than a government itself. For example, both monarchies and republics can and did have aristocrats as a sort of intermediary class between the people and the ruler. Aristocracy means rule of the best, not in a physical or performative sense, but also in a moral sense of high ethical standards. One could see the rulers and princes of Homeric Greece, as described in the epic poems surrounding the Trojan War, as an aristocracy, as well as the chariot elite of the Chinese Spring and Autumn period, where Confucianism begins. An oligarchy broadly means the rule of the few for personal gain, and more narrowly, the rule of money interests. In the broader sense, the late Soviet-era party apparatus could be seen as an oligarchy, and in the more narrow financial sense, the current U.S. political system. Polity has 2 meanings in Aristotle's work: the virtuous form of the rule of the many and a mixed regime. This latter meaning we shall return to later. Democracy can be seen as a corrupted rule of the many. Historical examples of polity would be Celtic and Germanic popular assemblies, the early Athenian constitution, the Swiss Confederation, the Icelandic Althing, and the New England direct democracy of the colonial period. Mob rule would be Athens in her later stages, the Roman Republic in her later stages, and the reign of terror in the French Revolution. From Aristotle to Polybius to Cicero, we have the development of the penultimate form of government, the mixed regime, or res publica, aka the republic. Classical and Western scholars saw each form of rule, the one, the few, and the many, as having strengths and weaknesses, whereby each element had certain defects that could lead to fatal trajectory errors. The idea was that by combining all these elements into a single political entity, hence the title mixed regime, each form of regime would supply the lack of the others. For example, if one element went off the rails, the other two could counter it. This balancing act was seen as the essence of politics. For example, he uses the term for Aristotle, he uses the term polity. This double meaning arises from the problem that the politics was a series of lecture notes, whereby rather than a direct transcription of a speech, whereby the rule of the few and the many in their virtuous forms, that is aristocracy and the first use of the term polity, join forces to balance the political system. Aristotle saw the masses and the elites as both supplied with an abundance of idleness, which he saw as potentially destabilizing to the polity. The middle class, defined as the property-owning class, is the happy middle between the two, the golden mean. The Roman Republic in its full form was commented on by Polybius as a masterpiece of political engineering, and Cicero bemoaned its degradation in his own day. Unlike the political systems of Athens and Sparta that could be traced to a single visionary such as Solon or Lycurgus, the Roman system was the result of social evolution and pragmatic application of social principles. The Roman system was a mixed regime in that it had a monarchical, aristocratic, and democratic elements. The monarchical element was represented in the consulship, the aristocratic element in the Senate, and the democratic element in the tribune of the plebs. The consuls had narrowly prescribed absolute power. What is meant by this is that during a military campaign, the consuls had absolute power to command. As consuls came in twos, each consul checked the power of the other. The Senate controlled the purse strings and the tribune had the power of the veto. This system eventually fell into decay and collapsed, in part for two reasons. As the powers of the consuls grew, in practice it exceeded the theoretical limits of government accountability, and consuls made war on each other and even Rome itself. With the influx of wealth from conquering the Mediterranean, the Roman state became an oligarchy where the wealthy ruled for private benefit, and then a tyranny of mob rule where oligarchs stirred up the people. As Aristotle feared, this led to the rise of Augustus and the end of republican government. How does this contrast with the anti-Western conception of autocracy? The concept of a god king, world monarchy, and absolute rule is an Asiatic notion found in Egypt, Babylon, and in the time of the Greeks in Persia. The tyrant rules by his own will, not law or custom. The tyrant has no connection to the people he rules over. The tyrant is arbitrary, and the tyrant seeks universal dominion. In their criticisms of the Persians, the Greeks and Romans again and again hit upon this notion of arbitrary rule. If a ruler could ignore law and long-held custom, then there is no way to predict his actions and plan accordingly. If his rule is absolute and or universal, he does not have a connection to any one group of people. How can universal rule in the long run be consistent with a real embodied connection with one's people? It's not. Over time, this leads to a kind of cosmopolitanism, which in the name of unity, equality, and integration leads to poverty, war, and oppression. The best way to contrast the Western form of kingship with autocracy is Agamemnon with Xerxes. Agamemnon and the Trojan cycle calls the other great kings to war to avenge his brother Menelaus. He must act in a collegiate fashion, as these men are his peers. In order to show he has skin in the game and is willing to take an L for the team, Agamemnon did something very foolish. He sacrificed his daughter Clytemnestra. That convinced the other kings of Greece, but in the end got him killed by his wife and her lover. Xerxes just takes what he wants and kills whoever stands in his way. Alexander did the same thing when in a drunken rage he killed Clytus the Black. We see the monarchy-autocracy line with Alexander in real time, with historians such as Arrian, Plutarch, and Diodorus Siculus, who describe the Macedonian political and military elite, sometimes even implicating Aristotle as strongly opposing Alexander's fall into tyranny. Alexander, when in Egypt, visiting the oasis of Siwa, saw himself as divine, when the priest declared him the son of Amun-Ra. Okay, some will claim that things have changed so much with modernity that the schema is no longer applicable. To these voices, I would say this is not so. Firstly, technology has not changed the fundamental nature of reality, but obscured it. By properly defining things and taking the correct perspective, one can see clearly. The main change to political thought that has occurred is the inclusion of a new class that never existed before, that of the technician. It is no fault of the classical and Renaissance political theorists who have overlooked this class, as they lacked every conceptual aid in formulating it. We, on the other hand, can see it. The main challenge between the idea of a ruling class based on technique rather than virtue, honor, wealth, or liberty is that the actual physical space taken up by machines creates an interlocking system that imposes costs on humans totally independently of the choices and decisions of the technicians. In this regard, the effects of the machine are like natural phenomena, and that they exist and operate on humans without the consent of the humans involved, and independently of the humans involved. It just is. But only partly so. As, for example, with new innovations or regulations, the nature of the technological infrastructure changes. Unlike all other classes, the technician class has the most outsized impact and is the most difficult to account for. Nonetheless, far from negating the need for familiarization with traditional forms of political thought, the solution of the technician problem can only be solved by such measures. For a placeholder, the closest category we have for this new class is the rule of the few, and in all probability a vicious few, so an oligarchy. Back to where we started, I think the best way to answer the question that we began with, how is autocracy an Asiatic import if Homeric Greece had kings, is a brief commentary on Kalisthenes' speech to Anaxarchus in opposition to Alexander's demand for his followers to engage in Persian act of obeisance known as proskynesis. The reason for this is that here in Arians, the Anabasis of Alexander, Book 4, Chapter 11, we have an articulate voice at the turning point in Western history, taking note of the novel and dangerous nature of this change. Kalisthenes was a philosopher in the court of Alexander, so we are talking about one of the intellectual elites of that time, not some mere courtier. Here is Kalisthenes' speech reproduced. O Anaxarchus, I openly declare that there is no honor which Alexander is unworthy to receive, provided that it is consistent with his being human. But men have made distinctions between those honors which are due to men and those due to gods in many different ways, as for instance by the building of temples and by the erection of statues. Moreover, for the gods, sacred enclosures are selected. To them sacrifices offered, and to them libations are made. Hymns are composed in honor of the gods, and eulogies for men. But the greatest distinction is made by custom of prostration, for it is the practice that men should be kissed by those who salute them, but because the deity is located somewhere above, it is not even lawful to touch him. And this is the reason, no doubt, why he is honored by prostration. Bands of choral dancers are also appointed for the gods, and paeans are sung in their honor. And this is not at all wonderful, saying that certain honors are specially assigned to some of the gods and certain others to other gods, and by Zeus, quite different ones again, or assigned to heroes, which are very distinct from those paid to the deities. It is not therefore reasonable to confound all these distinctions without discrimination, exalting men to a rank above their condition by extravagant accumulation of honors, and debasing the gods, as far as lies in human power, to an unseemly level by paying them honors only equal to those paid to men. He said that Alexander would not endure the affront if some private individual were to be thrust into his royal honors by an unjust vote, either by a show of hand or by ballot. Much more justly, then, would the gods be indignant at those mortals who usurp divine honors or suffer themselves to be thrust into them by others. Alexander not only seems to be, but is really beyond any competition, the bravest of the brave men, of the kings most kingly and of the generals the most worthy to command an army. O Anaxarchus, it was thy duty rather than other men's to become the special advocate of these arguments now adduced by me and the opponent of the contrary to them, seeing that thou associatest with him for the purposes of imparting philosophy and instruction. Therefore it was unseemly to begin this discussion when thou oughtst to have remembered that thou art not associating with and giving advice to Cambyses or Xerxes, but to the son of Philip, who derived his origin from Heracles and Achaeus, whose ancestors came into Macedonia from Argos, and have continued to rule the Macedonians not by force but by law. Not even to Hercules himself, while still alive, were divine honors paid by the Greeks. And even after his death, they were withheld until a decree had been published by the oracle of the god at Delphi that men should honor Hercules as a god. But if because the discussion is held in the land of foreigners, we ought to adopt the sentiment of foreigners, I demand, O Alexander, that thou shouldest think thyself of Greece, for whose sake the whole of this expedition was undertaken by thee, that thou mightest join Asia to Greece. Therefore make up thy mind whether thou wilt thither and return thither and compel the Greeks, who are men most devoted to freedom, to pay thee the honor of prostration, or whether thou wilt keep aloof from Greece and inflict this honor on the Macedonians alone, or thirdly, whether thou wilt thyself make a difference in every respect as to the honor paid to thee, so as to be honored by the Greeks and Macedonians as a human being, and after the manner of the Greeks, and by foreigners alone after the foreign fashion of prostration. But if it is said that Cyrus, son of Cambyses, was the first man to whom the honor of prostration was paid, and that afterward this degrading ceremony continued in vogue among the Persians and Medes, we ought to bear in mind that the Scythians, men poor but independent, chastised that Cyrus. Then other Scythians again chastised Darius, as the Athenians and Lacedaemonians did Xerxes, as Clearchus and Xenophon with their 10,000 did Artaxerxes, and finally that Alexander, though not honored with prostration, has conquered this Darius. This speech can be divided into 5 segments: Alexander's virtues, Greek customs, Persian customs, a dilemma, and a warning. Kalisthenes begins with the admission of the obvious. Alexander is a great man who has conquered a kingdom and is deserving of all honors given to men, but not honors given to divine beings. Kalisthenes then discusses Greek customs with giving and receiving honor, which comes in 3 kinds: honor given to great men, to heroes, semi-divine beings, and gods. While heroes can receive divine honors as the gods, they must first do so after death. Hercules is given as an example. For a mere man to receive such honors is an affront to the gods. And now the dilemma is he either forces the Persian customs on the Greeks, which isn't going to end well, according to Kalisthenes, or He's going to compartmentalize and have the East give him divine honors and then have the Greeks give him the honors of men. And the second one here is, let's see, compel the Greeks or keep aloof from Greeks. That's the second one. So either, force it on the Greeks, leave the Greeks alone, or just have this bifurcation. And he's like, that's not sustainable. You can't actually do that. You're going to have to decide which way you're going. He then turns to the Persian practice of prostration, which he argues was itself a recent innovation amongst the Persians, with one Cyrus, not the Great, son of Cambyses. To emphasize the impious nature of such an act, he mentions the Scythians as well, who know no such practice. And this is important because the Scythians are considered, barbarians, kind of like anarchists. But he's like, even they know that you shouldn't do this. The key element here is that he argues the line of the kings of Macedon, from Hercules down to Philip, knew no such practice. This is why there's a dividing line. He says the Macedonians rule by law, not by force. Even though they quote a king, they're nothing like the Persians. And that's the point of Kalisthenes. And all the other ancient biographies of Alexander admit that at the time, the Macedonians were very upset that Alexander was doing this because they saw this as a complete repudiation of their political practices. He then repeats the history of military defeats of the Persians at the hands of the Scythians, Greeks, and Macedonians over the last 150 years. We see here that the traditions of Europe are totally at odds with those of the Orient in this respect. In summary, the schema I use for political thought is the notion that we have minimally 7 kinds of regimes: monarchy, tyranny, aristocracy, oligarchy, polity, democracy, and republics. The virtuous and vicious form of the rule of the one, the few, and the many, along with a mixed regime. Plato gives us further clarity with subsets such as the rule for honor, wealth, and freedom. We can add technique to this list with the new class, the technocracy. A monarchy is not necessarily a tyranny because it is rooted in custom, reason, law, and possesses an organic connection with the people. A world sovereign does not have these qualities, and this concept first enters Western political thought with Alexander and the articulate warning by Kalisthenes on this turning point. Okay, we have Milton Walker, GF, and Corbin in the chat. Hello. GF, self-deification through power is a stain you can hardly erase into people's history. Yeah, I mean, Alexander really does represent a dangerous and bad trend arc for European thought. And it's ultimately rooted in idolatry. That's the point of Kalisthenes' warning, the idea that this autocrat becomes the god king. And of course, only, men are not gods, so treating them like a god is impious. So this is a thing. See, this is interesting, right? Because even the, people who are pagans, and we kind of look at the Roman Empire, especially after Augustus, where they do become gods. And that got Jews and Christians into trouble in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries. But that was not a position pagans started with, right? What European pagans initially thought, wow, this is a bad idea. We shouldn't be doing this. Only over time did this idea become ensconced in at least a Greco-Roman pagan tradition. Because again, as I've said elsewhere, the Slavonic peoples, according to Procopius, and then the Germanic and Celtic peoples all had direct democracies, with veches, moots, and things. So, yeah, that's not something even they would have accepted, right? This idea of an absolute ruler, a god king, this Eastern idea. China has it. Egypt has it. Various Middle Eastern kingdoms have it. This is just not, again, this is just something that is not Western. And again, why I have such a beef with reaction and neo-reaction. This is just an alien element that needs to be ejected. It's just not a part of our tradition. I mean, it's taken over, but other things have taken over too. Islam took over parts of Spain and the Balkans. It doesn't mean it's actually a part of our tradition. It just means that we've been occupied, basically. So, all right, everyone. That's tonight's show. Make sure to tune in Thursday for our repraise with Florian. He's sort of a regular now, so we have a lot of content coming. This is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.